Typhoon Yolanda brings to fore anew the issue of climate change. The calamity is raising hard questions as well. Is the Philippines prepared for another disaster of this magnitude? And what are we doing to mitigate the effects of this seemingly new normal? To discuss this, we have in the studio the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, Renato Redentor Constantino. Good morning, Red, and welcome to Solar Daybreak.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me here.
You know, there was a rumor last week that we should be expecting another super typhoon, even stronger than Yolanda, although Pag-asa has denied this. But Mitzi, if we look back in our recent history, I mean, 2009, we had Ondoy, 2011, Sendong, 2012, Pablo, and 2013, Yolanda. Is it safe to assume that we can forecast another super typhoon sometime this year?
I think what is safer to assume is that there will be uncertainty throughout the year, and that we are already aware of the kind of impacts that extreme weather events can create, can impose on the country, and that we should just be prepared. We shouldn't panic. We shouldn't assume that there will be apocalyptic events taking place, but we should assume that in event that such extreme impacts take place, that we should be prepared. We should know better. We should act with greater knowledge of what is in store and what we are capable of doing to protect our families and our communities.
But is the Philippines prepared? Are we prepared? Do you think that we would know by now what to do and how we can prevent or we can lessen the impact?
The thing to consider seriously involves maybe three things. One is that uncertainty will take place throughout the year, and no one knows this better than those whose livelihoods depend on weather. For instance, farmers. Changes are taking place in minute and in large ways, and if we are focused only on a single episodic massive events, then we miss preparing for things that are taking place throughout the year. And this is the second thing that I wanted to talk about. While there is great focus at the moment on episodic extreme weather events, this can also be unhealthy because it also ignores the fact that climate change occurs throughout the year. It's not going to take place only because of one single event. It's already taking place throughout the year in terms of lower rainfall, for instance, that is already affecting the yield of crops, or higher rainfall, which it does not necessarily translate to extreme flooding. These are non-visual impacts. They're not calamitous, they're not catastrophic.
It's not immediately felt.
It's not immediately felt.
It takes a long time.
It takes a long time. It may even be gradual. But the effect on crop yields, on livelihoods, can be equally, if not more, devastating. And these are often called slow onset impact events. And slow is relative. Some are drier than others and will continue to become progressively drier. Others are wetter. And we have to take into account both kinds of impacts and not just be fixated on episodic impacts.
Well, if I may take off from Amelin's point earlier, when you talk about global climate change, the Philippines is a very small player. So
Yes.
at the UN climate talks, for example, we always hear countries like our own commissioner, Yeb Sanyo, was asking for countries like the US, especially in Europe, to really make big commitments to mitigating climate change. What do you think about this? I mean, what should the Philippines do? Or, like people like, other countries like China also are kind of sitting on the
Yes.
fence. So where do we stand in all of this?
Number one, our vulnerability should be pretty evident by now.
Yeah.
And I think our voice is really, really extremely important in the international arena. The more we call out for rapid change in political leadership, in the way that we can take actions boldly on the global arena, the better it is for everyone. That's a measure of solidarity that we can extend not only to our countrymen, but also to other smaller or equally vulnerable countries that require attention even as you speak. On the other hand, vulnerability does not mean, or even the smallest of our contribution to the problem does not mean that we shouldn't act as well. Every single contribution that we make to bring down greenhouse gas emissions will count ultimately. Because even if all the rich countries stop their emissions tomorrow, developing countries are also required to contribute because it will not be enough. So it's a measure of dignity that even though we recognize we have a small contribution to the problem, we also know that we have to act and contribute to the solution. The last point is, I think, even as we call out for action on the global stage, the imperative of action must take place domestically. So on the one hand, a lot of people, including myself, applauded the bold voice that government had issued, especially during the Warsaw talks, to call for bigger change to take place
and
abroad.
More funding for
and
adaptation.
more funding for adaptation particularly. That call has not resonated in the country, which is sad.
Even with Yolanda. and
Even with
everything.
Yolanda. I think people looked at Yolanda and the calls were made after. Before that, I'm not sure how strong the calls were. Lagi tayong reactive, and it's a mode that we urgently need to get out of. Because if you look at the numbers, and numbers will always tell you, give you the best indication as to whether we're prepared or not. The numbers are not a source of comfort. Most of the overseas related adaptation money in the last few years are coming as reactive funding, not as in terms of adaptive, strategic, preparatory planning, but mostly in response to something that has already occurred. This is in comparison with other countries like Uganda or Zambia or Nepal, whose funds from abroad are largely being used to prepare for, to adapt to what they foresee as the new normal. Sa atin, it's still in response to, after the fact. And
Yeah.
that has to change.
And what was recent is that there's a rehabilitation czar. There's a 14.6 billion peso supplemental budget, but for relief and rehabilitation.
Yes.
But the People's Survival Fund still remains empty, and it's not even part of the program funds for 2014. What's your reaction to that, Red?
Well, it's something we look at with alarm, because I think if we are able to project the voice of the country abroad in terms of calling for funding for climate change adaptation, we should do even equally or even more, register that voice to call for a wholesale redesign of our economy, of the way we formulate our budgets. And that hasn't taken place. One proof, People's Survival Fund, passed in 2012, remains unfunded. And this is a fund not for national government, it's for local governments and communities. And because it remains empty, and largely empty because the executive submitted a budget without funding for the People's Survival Fund, then local governments will have to struggle through an entire year again with the same budget that mainly makes them go to Malacanang with a begging bowl, waiting for national government to provide them whatever funds are available. The People's Survival Fund could have provided them a predictable source of money. But it's not too late. We should use this entire year, learn the lesson, and ensure that it is funded. Congress is responding. That's great. I think the executive has also heard the signal. So maybe they will get their act together.
And also the fact that we have the UN Green Climate Fund now based in the Philippines. It's being headed by a Filipino. What do you think about that? Will that bring more change in terms of
I
climate
think
change
I
projects?
think Governor Salceda, who is also the co-chair of the Green Climate Fund, I think he would completely agree with the statement that we should struggle and make sure that the Green Climate Fund is used correctly. But first, it needs funding because it doesn't have funding at the moment. What does that mean? If there's anything that Warsaw, the climate talks in Warsaw, the message that it gave out is that we're on our own. And we shouldn't rely on the largesse or generosity of other countries at the moment. So the more we can put money into our own funds and redirect our budget towards adaptation, to mainstream climate change into development planning processes, the better it will be for localities. Local governments are at the front line of the crisis. They don't have the support, the predictable support that they require.
Now, why don't we look at best practices
Yes.
or sustainable development that we can replicate for 2014? Or what can we look forward to in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation?
Well, that's something that my organization is monitoring very closely, where money is really going to go, whether government has learned its lessons, whether it remains fixated on extreme weather events only, or whether it's already preparing to help the poor communities, farmers, fisher folk adapt to a new reality. That's very important because money, resources need to flow in the right areas, need to go to not only to the public in general, but to farming communities, to women, to rural communities that require the means to adapt to and learn about more the threats that are coming their way. That's one. The second is there are other things that we can already do that do not require large funding or other means from abroad. A shift to renewable energy, more solar power for communities, sustainable transport, more bicycling, more widespread sustainable waste management practices. Those are all things that are in our hands.
So is that your hope for 2014, or do you have something to add to that?
I'm always hopeful, I'm always optimistic, even though there's a lot of things that are not exactly going well in this country. If there's one thing that Yolanda demonstrated, it's our capacity to extend solidarity to one another. Nandun yung Oplan Hatid, where volunteers just simply came together to care for the victims of the typhoon. People went around the world from migrant communities to communities that were already that had been hit before by other extreme weather events to contribute to solutions or to funding the needs of the typhoon victims. There's a lot of room for working together in this country, and I think that's something that we need to constantly be aware of. Kaya natin ito if only we get our acts together.
So responding to climate change is a big commitment, and we all need to work together.
Yes.
That's a good way to start the new year.
Yep.
Thoughts of cooperation and
Leadership
commitment.
comes from below,
Right.
not only from central government, and conscious acts of community is the way to go.
Right.
Okay,
And
thank
you're
you.
setting the example. Yeah, setting a
Thank
good
you.
example.
We start with us as well, yeah,
Exactly.
on our own. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Red Constantino, he's the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Thank you so much, Red, and good morning.
Thanks for having me.